affects average Americans. Columnists talk about recent government scandals, special interests, and changes to lobbying rules. From the Center for American Progress, this is an hour and a half.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Podesta, and on behalf of the Center for American Progress, I want to thank you all for being here. To kick things off, I want to begin by thanking David for coming back here today. I'll give a more complete bio later, but it's a pleasure to have one of our most quoted and quotable alums back at the Center. As some of you know, David served as a fellow here at CAP, where he helped get our daily publication, the Progress Report, up and running. For those of you who don't subscribe, I recommend it. His work was always sharp, his analysis was always hard-hitting, and his contributions to the Center were invaluable and immeasurable. And obviously we're here in part to celebrate David's book, Hostile Takeover, which I will talk again a little bit more about, but copies are available in the back or online at Amazon.com, I'm sure. Since leaving the Center for the Big Sky of Montana, David has not only become the world's most unlikely cowboy, he has helped the state elect its first Democratic governor in 16 years and has written a quite interesting book. That book, as I said, will help shape our discussion today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce the rest of our panelists and give a more formal introduction to David. But first, I wanted to say a few words about our topic today, how corruption affects the average American. We all know that the influence of money on politics is substantial, it's growing, and it has real consequences for you and me. At the state level, lobbying is already a $1 billion per year industry. This is no surprise when in much of America, state legislatures only serve part-time and with a severely limited staff. Without a staff to craft effective legislation for constituents, state legislators often turn to lobbyist pre-written legislation. Even at the national level, with more staff available to filter the lobbyist-authored legislation, folks like Jack Abramoff spent billions of dollars and developed increasingly creative and, of course, in his case, criminal ways to influence our public officials. Consider how Randy Duke Cunningham was able to take tens of thousands of dollars in bribes from defense contractors while living on a yacht provided by one of them. Or consider that Tom DeLay flew to his court-ordered appearance in his corporate money laundering case on a jet owned by RJR Reynolds Tobacco Company, the same company that contributed $17,000 to his defense. It's important to note, though, that this pay-to-play system between lobbyists and lawmakers runs much deeper than a few members or a few campaign contributions, luxurious gifts, or even golf trips to Scotland. It's an institutionalized system of corruption, and that's, I think, what David's book really attempts to chronicle. For instance, as our senior fellow and another former colleague of David, Scott Lilly, has pointed out, there's an intimate connection, and I mean that pun only partially, between campaign fundraisers and the lobbyists that advocate for appropriations earmarks, often inserted into the dead of night in appropriations bills. David also worked on the Appropriations Committee for Congressman Dave Obey. He's well aware of that. But I think in the wake of the Cunningham bribery scandal, I think a lot of people around the country are wondering just how many members have been persuaded to support earmarks, not based on what it might do for their congressional district, but what it might do for them personally. The bottom line is that corruption has almost become the norm on Capitol Hill. I think it's a problem that got worse, particularly under Mr. DeLay's leadership, and can only be corrected by real substantial reform and not the cosmetic attempts at it that we saw in the House last week. This corruption on Capitol Hill and of our political culture in general is well documented in this new book. David's research demonstrates just how lucrative government can be for those who have a hand in writing special interest favors into law. His insight is sharp, his examination is critical, and true to form, it's not without controversy. While David and I agree that corruption is a serious threat to our system of government, we sometimes disagree, as we did while we were here. I think sometimes I see legitimate policy disputes that are occurring where David sees the influence of money and corruption. And I think that by attacking those who you have a substantive beef with, I think you end up demonizing the legitimate debate, and sometimes you blur the lines between guilt and innocence and hinder our ability to expose real corruption. But I think that David's book, I think, really does point to very, very serious flaws in our system, to corruption as a serious problem, and it's a problem that can't be solved by the entire system of actors. It has to be shown, demonstrated, and pinpointed, which is what he's done. I think the solution requires ultimately for all of us to work together. I saw Shelley Pingree from Common Cause enter. She's here someplace in the crowd. To expose, and I think all of us trying to work together can help expose real corruption, to push back on the radical ideas that are leading the country in the wrong direction, to restore a positive, progressive vision of government, and to do so in a way that speaks to all Americans. Today, I hope that we'll have an informative debate not only about how corruption is affecting the American people, but about how the progressive community can address it collectively. With that, it's now my pleasure to introduce our panel. As I mentioned, David Sirota is the author of the new book, Hostile Takeover: How Big Money and Corruption Conquered Our Government and How We Take It Back. He's the senior editor at In These Times, a regular contributor to The Nation and the American Prospect, a twice-weekly guest on The Al Franken Show, and the co-chair of the Progressive Legislative Action Network, which is a new organization which I hope David will talk about, which tries to get at this question at the state governmental level. Previously, David served as press secretary to Representative Bernie Sanders, as a senior strategist to Montana Governor Brian Schweitzer, as I mentioned, as the press secretary of the House Appropriations Committee, and of course as a fellow here at the Center for American Progress. After we hear from David, we'll hear from Peter Gosselin. He's the national economics correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, Washington, D.C. Bureau. In his prolific 30-year career in journalism, he has written for the Boston Globe, the Providence Journal, the Massachusetts Transcript, New York's Daily Mail, in addition to others. He's won numerous awards for his work, including the Sidney Hillman Award, the Aronson Award for Social Justice Reporting, the National Headliner Award, and he is a two-time winner of the George Polk Award. Peter holds a bachelor's degree from Brown and a master's from Columbia, and we're happy that he could join us today. And last, we'll hear from Rui Teixeira. Rui is a joint fellow here at the Center for American Progress and the Century Foundation. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has worked at the Progressive Policy Institute, the Economic Policy Institute, and Brookings Institution before joining our institution. Rui is an expert on voter turnout and public opinion. He's the author of 5 books, more than 100 articles, including The Disappearing American Voter and The Emerging Democratic Majority. He publishes a weekly online column, Public Opinion Watch. He has a very important, along with another fellow here at the center, John Halpin, a very important piece up currently on the American Prospect website, which I recommend to you all. I'm now going to turn over the floor to David to make some introductory comments, followed by remarks from Peter and then Rui. Then maybe I'll ask a question or two and then open it up to the audience.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the Center for hosting this event, and I want to thank the panelists here for agreeing to do it. I want to thank everybody who's here, especially in light of the fact that this book, as John alluded to, obviously pulls no punches, so I appreciate the forum. The fundamental assertion of this book is that corruption goes way beyond Duke Cunningham, Tom DeLay, bribery, and vote buying. That corruption is really at the heart of how politicians in the political debate talk about issues. And that the debates on the major economic issues of the day are designed to marginalize the common sense policies that Americans support and that public opinion shows Americans support. And that's pretty well documented in the book. The question for this forum is, how does that corruption affect the ordinary citizen? Because as the book says in the introduction, this book is really for the ordinary citizen. I use that term not derisively. It's a term that's used because I think a lot of political books and a lot of the political debate is designed not to be speaking to the ordinary citizen out there, and that's part of the reason why cynicism is so heavily on the rise. And I think it's quite clear. I think we have a lot of recent examples as to how corruption affects the ordinary citizen. A good example is energy. Our energy policy, up until very recently, has largely focused on a debate between which oil companies to give which tax breaks to. And now we sit here with $3 gasoline, with skyrocketing utility costs, and we wonder why. Why was the debate limited essentially to those terms? Well, because there's large, big money interests making a lot of money off that. Interests that give a lot of money to politicians. It's the same thing with health care. Polls have consistently shown that Americans support a universal health care program. It's usually in the 60 to 70% range. It goes down just a bit when you ask folks whether they would accept some sacrifices, including taboo sacrifices like tax increases. That's not talked about in the political arena. It's sort of talked about in terms of expanding health care piecemeal, but the concept of a universal, for instance, single-payer health care system is not really ever legitimately discussed as a mainstream position, even though it is a mainstream position among the population. Prescription drugs. What is the effect on the average citizen, the debate that's gone on over prescription drugs? Well, we've had a Medicare bill that cost about $1 trillion that gave most of that to the drug companies because our debate never asked the question whether we should have some sort of controls on drug prices. And obviously, as many of you know, the Medicare bill was stripped of its ability to allow the government to negotiate lower prices for prescription drugs. And so for the average citizen, what we have is the people who are not covered by Medicare, prices continue to skyrocket out of control. The Medicare bill, for those who receive it, provides a completely inadequate benefit. Wages, this is obvious. The minimum wage has reached a 50-year low in terms of purchasing power. Any bill that comes up to raise the minimum wage is voted down. And if it's not voted down, then the alternative, like we saw last year, Rick Santorum's alternative, was a bill that purported to raise the minimum wage but would have eliminated the minimum wage for millions of people. And I think that corruption is also apparent to the average American and how it affects them in what we don't talk about. And the best example of this, I think, is on immigration. This is a debate that's been roiling the country. It's all over the media. It's a debate that focuses on whether to allow people who are here illegally to gain citizenship. And it's a debate that hasn't at all talked about one of the roots of the problem: the decimation of the Mexican economy. We have a debate going on about this issue that focuses exclusively on border control and citizenship questions, and not on questions of how our corporate written trade policy has destroyed the Mexican economy. Since NAFTA has passed, tens of millions more Mexicans are now in poverty. This is a bill that was stripped of all labor, human rights, and environmental provisions that may have moved towards having that trade policy benefit ordinary Mexicans. And so the fact that we're having a debate in this country, or in the political process, I should say, that doesn't even discuss NAFTA, means that we are ultimately going to get a policy, any policy that comes out of it, I would argue, will not actually address the problem. And so the problem will continue. All of the problems associated with illegal immigration that do affect the average American, those won't be addressed. So the key here is, I think, and we can discuss the solutions to this, the solution, I would submit, has to be a real attack on the campaign finance system. Because what we have now is a government that is operating on behalf of the big money interests who finance political campaigns. Now, the argument against the public financing system of elections, for instance, is it's welfare for politicians. It's giving money to politicians. My answer to that is you get what you pay for. Somebody is going to pay for these elections. Somebody is paying for these elections. Large corporations and the super wealthy largely. And that until we give good people a way to run for office, which allows them to run for office without being specialists in shaking down big money interests for cash, we will never have a government that we own and which can actually solve these problems. Because the fundamental problem we face is We don't have a government anymore that solves problems. Polls show that the public essentially knows that in all different sorts of ways. The reason why our government doesn't solve problems is because the policies that it produces from these distorted debates that I've talked about, these policies will never, ever challenge the big money interests that are often at the center of the challenges our country face. So this is what the book is all about. I hope folks will read it, ask questions to me about it. You can email me. We can talk about it here in this debate. But the fundamental assertion in this book is that in order to understand corruption, we have to understand that the debate on major economic issues is artificially distorted and limited to confine policy prescriptions only to those policies that do not challenge the interests at the heart of our problems.
Peter, you've covered this city for a while. What's your perspective on both David's argument and where you see things today in our nation's capital?
Well, let me start by saying I'm grateful to David for the notice he has given both my work in the Los Angeles Times, both in his blogging and in the book. And for anybody who's concerned that the midterms of the 2008 presidential debate will be a tepid affair with the big issues shoved aside and all the airtime consumed by mincing small talk, Sirota should put your worries to rest. On the evidence of the panel and the book, the next 2 years will witness a gargantuan political clash, which is certainly good news for journalists, and I think ultimately for the country. This said, I want to start by putting some light between myself and the panel, and I'm going to do this by unilaterally changing my assignment. I'm not going to directly address the question, how does corruption affect average Americans, but I hope address something that is you find useful. I do this for two reasons. First, alone on this panel today, I am a member of the mainstream media. And as this crowd knows better than most, we're a much maligned group. And indeed, David devotes a fair amount of the book to maligning us. Worse yet, we're eulogized. But my fellow MSNers and I still believe that, fail often to meet our own standards though we do, the basic job of journalism remains a useful one, and that is to find out stuff. Political stuff, economic stuff, national security, cultural, maybe even spiritual stuff that can help people get on with their lives and to put that stuff in the public domain. That's a different job from those of politician, political operative, political thinker. I don't say it's better or worse, it's different. And I'd just like to keep the division of labor where it is. Secondly, I am not as confident as David that the discussion that the political parties and the candidates will have with the American voters over the next 2 years will center primarily on corruption. It may. We may look back on this era and see that this was one of those crucial throw the bums out moments in American history, and Sirota was a sage. But I'm just not sure. And I'm not sure because I'm not sure that most Americans are ready yet to do what I think many see as part and parcel of throwing who Sirota identifies as the bums out, which is to throw in the towel on the core elements of the Reagan Revolution: free markets, limited government, 401ks, and forging your own future. If I'm correct, the political conversation will have to begin where most voters are, not in a corrupt Washington, but in their own economic lives, the practical lives of their work, home, school, kids. And it will have to be conducted, at least for now, in a language that doesn't assume they've already reached a decision about either the bums or free markets. Corruption may be part of that discussion. Hearing about CEOs selling out their company stock while touting it to employees, or political leaders being jetted to the finest golf courses of the world, are attention grabbers for a family scrambling to keep up the house payments and get their kids good education. But once you've got the voters' attention, what are you going to say about their lives, making their lives better, not just the bums worse? Now, I've been around long enough to know that meeting voters where they live, as they say, sounds like pablum to a lot of politicians. Economics has a funny way of fading into the background, of becoming a wallpaper in the living room of American politics. But sometimes, every once in a while, it jumps to the foreground, and this may be one such time. Which brings me to my self-appointed task, which is to briefly describe a line of stories I've been working along for the past few years and suggest what implications they might have for the coming debate. These stories grow out of a phenomenon that we've seen repeatedly over the past 25 years and we're seeing again today. That of an economy that the economists say is doing splendidly, thank you very much, and that a large number of Americans, perhaps a majority, say they can't find. The stories also grow out of a dissatisfaction with some of the most widely held explanations of this mismatch. That, for example, of former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, who used to explain working Americans' economic insecurities by pointing in a general sort of way to globalization and tech change, but usually ending up talking about it as sort of a psychological funk that would eventually pass. That of analysts who focus solely on income inequality, arguing that the benefits of growth have become the exclusive preserve of the top you-pick-the-number small fraction of Americans, and that the rest of the country doesn't appreciate economic improvement because they don't get the benefit of it. This is an explanation that overlooks the fact that even in boom times like the late 1990s, when we know that growth went well below a few percenters, large numbers of Americans continued telling pollsters they didn't see the benefits of growth or didn't think they'd last. Finally, there's the explanations of a whole class of commentators who are coming to the fore again, who argue that it's the nabobs of negativism or some sort of weakening of moral fiber that's behind Americans' consistently overdark reading of their own economic circumstances. Suffice it to say that none of these explanations, particularly this last one, seem very satisfactory to me. In a nutshell, the argument I've made in stories over the last 2 years is that there's an economic trend that's been underway for the past quarter century that's gone largely unnoticed. And it's not that inflation has been beaten, it's not that the GDP did this, it's not that the stock market did that, it's that there has been an immense shift of economic risk from the broad shoulders of business and government to the backs of working families, from the working poor to the reasonably rich. In part, this trend is the product of fewer employers providing jobs with the kind of benefits that act as buffers against bad times. In part, it is that government provides fewer backstops in case of troubles. In part, it's more subtle changes like economic advances of families that are real advances, but that have left them playing the game, the economic game, further above what safety nets still exist, and therefore with farther to fall should anything go wrong. I've tried to document this trend in two ways. By generating a set of numbers that don't ask the typical question of where in the economic pecking order at any given moment a particular family is, rather how families got from one point wherever they were to some other point in the pecking order. Did they move in nice, neat, hopefully upward increments of income, or did their income fly through the ceiling and fall through the floor? In looking at this volatility of income rather than that pecking order question, I've taken a page from the stock market, where the risk of a stock, its beta, is measured in a similar fashion by how much it swings around. And what did I find? That the volatility of family income and that the risks that I argue it signals have doubled in the last 25 years. The other way I've sought to document the trend is by following the lives of people. People like Paul Frido, a 50-something financial specialist who was until recently the CFO of a subsidiary of a major French corporation and therefore the number 2 or 3 man in the company, but as a temp told whether or not to come back every Friday. Like Elvira Rojas, a 30-something Salvadoran woman who got a toehold on the good life in the mid-90s when she managed to combine a unionized hotel dishwashing job with a job at the LAX Burger King, only to watch the whole thing crumble when the hotel went non-union and she was laid off after 9/11. She's just recently gotten back to what she was making 10 years ago. People like Deborah Potter, who was one of the top sellers of group health and disability insurance in the state of Virginia until she was diagnosed a few years ago with multiple sclerosis and had to engage in a 3-year battle with the company whose very policies she was selling, and whose income as a result dropped from close to $300,000 to the $30,000 her preacher husband made until the company finally started paying. Now I want you to notice a couple things about my numbers and the people that I've been reporting on. things that I think have implications for the conversations the political parties and the candidates may have with the voters in the next few years. The numbers come out of the financial markets and the language of markets that has so insinuated itself in American society during the past 25 years. They don't ask people to judge their circumstances by some new standard of an imagined better world, but by the very standards of the markets, of risk and reward, that they've been told is the proper measure of most things practical. And as for the people, they are winners, not losers, who in large measure have taken the changes in how the United States economy works and gotten on with their lives best as they could. By almost any conventional measures, they're either doing well or improving their lots. It is only when one looks behind the curtain at their circumstances that you realize, a little like the Wizard of Oz, that they are operating without all of what you thought was there, what was once there for many middle and upper middle class Americans. To whatever extent those of you who will be at the center of the coming political battle care to draw morals from these stories, I'd hope they'd be these. That while corruption has a place in the conversation, there are plenty of ways to talk about how people are living their economic lives today and how those lives could be improved that don't start with throwing the bums out or giving up on free markets. That for Republicans, the big question will be how to ensure in a free market economy where households are bearing increased risk, that most of those who work hard and play by the rules succeed, and in the case of those who don't, their falls are not lethal. That for Democrats, the big question will be how to assure whatever new protections against economic upheaval you offer working families, they do not turn into the big government boondoggles that rightly or wrongly your party still has a reputation for creating. 25 years ago, the political scientist Charles Lindblom described markets as all fingers, no thumb. Good on the fine-grained stuff, terrible on the big decisions. And government is all thumbs, no finger. Great on the broad outlines, terrible on the small stuff. We may well be at a moment where the nation wants to rediscover the virtue of thumbs. But in the discovering, the parties and the candidates are going to have to remember that thumbs and fingers work together, and only together do they work well. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That's terrific. Rui, I want you to comment on the book, but I also think that you've thought a lot recently about Peter's challenge, and maybe you could, at the end, I don't want to interfere with what you were planning to say, but maybe pick up the gauntlet too then.
Well, in regard to David's book, and one thing I always do like about David is, you don't have to tell him to take the gloves off and tell you what he really thinks, because it's right there in front of you. And I think this is like a very good book. I mean, I do recommend it. I think everyone should go out and buy it, if not several copies, for their friends and family. How about that, David, for a plug? Thank you. But I think that we have to realize its limitations. I mean, I think it's a very good reference book. I think he does a great job documenting a lot of the abuses that powerful economic actors are participating in these days, gaming the system, taking advantage of it for their own purposes. And I think a lot of the policies he proposes in the book are quite useful. And there's quite a lot of sort of truth-telling and myth-busting in the book that again, is quite useful. But I do think that the book aspires to do more. And I think you can see that from looking at the very end of the subtitle, How We Take It Back. Well, how do we take it back? Does David's implicit and sometimes explicit recommendations really hold up? And that's really where I have my questions. I think in essence, what David is recommending is that we tell the truth about how big money is corrupting the system and taking advantage of the way things work and functioning against your interests. And if we tell people the truth often enough and loudly enough, they will rise up and demand better policies, and then we'll be off to the races. I don't think that's adequate, and let me explain why. I think this is a classic form, or as close as you can get to sort of a pure populist kind of approach to what we should do in American politics today. As progressives, it's saying let's emphasize the abuses, let's get people to rise up against them, let's tap their anger, And, let's just keep on, just if it hasn't worked yet, it just means we have to talk longer, louder, and with a higher truth content. I don't think that really captures where people are at today when they look at the economy and when they think about their lives. They are aware of a lot of the abuses that David talks about. They're quite aware, and they're actually more hostile to big business and corporate interests than they've probably been for at least 20 years, according to the data. They do see the system as being skewed against them in important ways. They're quite aware of the challenges that exist today to achieving and maintaining a middle-class lifestyle. So that component of what David has to say it does make some sense to people. That kind of backward-looking alarm, the system is being gamed, the system is being abused, the system is corrupted. I think people hear that to a large extent. In fact, to some extent, they already believe it. So you're not telling them something they in a sense, don't already know. But I think what's missing here is the other part of the way of the populist analysis or approach, if you will, that progressives need to take toward voters, which is the kind of forward-looking optimism. Voters don't see themselves. The typical person in the United States does not see themselves as a loser. They see themselves as a winner. They see themselves as someone who is confronting very serious obstacles to getting ahead and yet still manages to get ahead. They see themselves, in a sense, as a hero in their own drama. They see themselves as part of a system that has a great deal of resilience, and they see themselves as someone, them and their family, as a unit that is actually confronting these obstacles and managing to get ahead, again, as a hero in their own drama. And if all you're telling people, or mostly what you're telling people, is you're abused, you're downtrodden, you're not getting ahead, you're going nowhere, you're a loser, you're stuck, people will not really hear everything that you have to say. Let's look at some data from the New York Times poll on class in the spring of 2005, because they illustrate this kind of forward-looking optimism that coexists with this sort of backward-looking alarm about the way the system is currently functioning. 70% of people in this survey said they had already attained or would attain the American dream. 2/3 said they were doing better than their parents did at a comparable age. 56% said they expected their kids to do better than they did at a comparable age. 80% said with hard work and with a willingness to work hard, you could start out poor and still become rich in this country. An amazing 45% said they thought it was very or somewhat likely that they themselves would become wealthy someday. These are optimistic views, and they reflect the fact that people see themselves as succeeding in the face of great obstacles. And if you cannot speak to people's aspirations, but only to the ways in which they're having a hard time, you will have a very difficult time reaching them about the kind of economic policies you want. And I think in that regard, it's of some significance that despite all the good policies that David reviews in the book, he has actually very little to say about education, which is a key aspect of how people aspire to get ahead in this country and how they see their children getting ahead. I propose here to kind of summarize a way of evaluating David's approach, and other approaches too for that matter, what I call the white working class test. And if you want some more in this, and in fact this whole discussion, there was a very useful discussion of David's book on the Talking Points Cafe book club last week, where I and David and a number of other people had at these issues, and I recommend it to you. But here's the white working class test. Look at whites without a 4-year college degree, what I define as the white working class. These are overwhelmingly voters of moderate to low income, and by definition of modest credentials. But do they see at this point their aspirations for a stable middle class life linked to progressives' views and the progressive program? I don't think they do. And let's sort of roll the tape here on the latest data. In 2000, Gore lost these voters by 17 points. In 2004, Kerry lost these voters by 23 points. That swing alone is enough to explain Bush's victory in 2004 over Kerry, that alone. And then if you look at the voters within that group who have the most purchase on a middle-class lifestyle, those between $30,000 and $75,000 in household income, those between 30 and 50K, Kerry lost by 24 points. Those between 50 and 75K, who are whites without a 4-year college degree, Kerry lost by an astonishing 41 points. You cannot lose this badly among this huge sector of the electorate and expect to build a progressive majority coalition. These voters, according to my analysis of census data, are still slightly over half of U.S. voters. And even within another 10 years, they'll still be 46 to 47% of voters. So does David's approach pass the white working class test? I don't think so. I don't think so, because these voters see themselves, again, as succeeding in the face of great obstacles. They have aspirations. They want to know how they can get ahead. They want to know about their opportunities. They know they're getting screwed to a large extent. They're already quite cynical about the system. What they want to know is where you stand on helping them get ahead. And they need to hear that combination of backward-looking alarm and forward-looking optimism that I think truly does characterize these kinds of voters. And to give myself a little plug, and John Halpin, we do have a lengthy article now that I think is finally up in PDF format on the American Prospect website called The Politics of Definition, the Real Third Way, where we argue that progressives need to define themselves in terms of a common good progressivism. Details can be found in the article, but basically that argues we're all in this together and we can provide, everyone can be provided opportunity, everyone can realize their aspirations, and that doing that is what progressivism should be about. But again, I refer you to the somewhat lengthy article for all the copious details about that. So in sum, I think that David has provided a useful reference book, but I do think we need to be cautious about its applicability as a strategic framework. Thanks.
I think we're going to give David a chance to respond. I think actually both Peter and Rui were to some extent pointed, I think, in similar direction. And I think that David, as I was listening to Rui, my guess is that there's a part of this you really would agree with, which is the analysis of where people stand today, but would argue that you have provided something more positive in the context of this book. But why don't you have at it?
Well, there's a lot to go at here. I do agree with Rui that we do need an aspirational politics. In fact, I think that this book provides a very aspirational politics. Every chapter has specific policy goals. Every chapter includes heroes who have been fighting the hostile takeover. And the end is an entire chapter on exactly how I think, it's one man's opinion, how we can take our government back. I think that Rui cites the right poll numbers. People are aspirational. I think there's a contradiction in what he said, though. He said that people already know the truth. People already understand the world around them. He cites the New York Times numbers, the survey numbers showing that people think that there's essentially all sorts of social mobility in America. But obviously those people haven't read the actual stats. The Wall Street Journal last year came out with a long story about how social mobility is at a historic low in the United States. The Economist soon corroborated the same thing, that social mobility in the United States is often lower than it is even in European and Scandinavian socialist countries. So I don't think people really do know the full extent of what really is going on. I think they have a sense of what's going on, but I don't really think they fully understand. And I don't blame ordinary voters or citizens out there, because as I document in this book, the entire political propaganda system is designed to make people not think about those things. And I don't mean to pick on you, Peter, but we talked about the free market. I would argue that that's one of the most vicious and overused theories that doesn't really relate to what kind of an economy we actually live in. Here's a page 9 in my book, just to give an example of what I'm talking about. What I basically say is this free market, we're told, means we must have fewer regulations that protect citizens, less taxation of the rich, and no mandates on business to fulfill any social responsibilities other than increasing corporations' bottom line. That's the free market. It's free. At the same time, this free market is to be ignored when it might actually benefit ordinary citizens. So in one breath, we have politicians tell us that price controls for medicines are bad, but restrictive patent laws that get abused, protectionist patent measures, they're good. That's something that's part of the free market. Regulations against energy price gouging are bad. They violate the free market. But government handouts and subsidies to big oil companies, that's considered good by the free marketeers. Protecting American jobs at home, that's bad. That's against the free market. But government, through institutions like, for instance, the Export-Import Bank, subsidizing the outsourcing of American jobs, that's good. That's okay. In other words, they tell us that government and the free market is only okay when it only helps big money interests. So again, the point of saying that is I think that the population is fundamentally misled. And so I don't blame ordinary citizens for instance, within the context of this debate, thinking that there is all sorts of social mobility in America, and that America is the place where you really can, as opposed to most other countries, go from rags to riches, because that's what's being told. That's the storyline. That storyline is not an accident. It's deliberate. Where I do agree, again, is on aspirational politics. I think that what we have to do, and this relates favorably to what you said, I do think that what we have to do is not just scream corruption, 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 throw the bums out, throw the bums out. In fact, when I started writing this book, I made very carefully, I took care to include how we can take it back. And as I joked to some friends earlier, if I wrote this book 10 years from now, I would just eliminate how we take it back. I would just, it's over. We're done. There's no way to take it back. Just how big money and corruption conquered our government, period. Probably would have been a shorter book, too. So I think it is fundamental to connect corruption to the challenges people face, to show that corruption in our government is a direct obstacle to the aspirations of society, to show that corruption is an inhibitor of the idea that people have opportunity, and that curing corruption, addressing corruption fundamentally through, for instance, public financing of elections, and that's just one example in the book, that addressing corruption is actually a way to increase and expand opportunity in this country.
Peter, I think we're using the term corruption in very different ways. I mean, and I think David in his opening comments sort of pointed out the fact that he sees this problem as a lot bigger than even the pay-for-play schemes that we see on Capitol Hill today, or certainly Duke Cunningham or other people who have actually violated their oath, violated the law, and are, in Mr. Cunningham's case, headed for prison. But I think David's using the term corruption in a much broader sense, I suppose, that is really in a winner-take-all economy, which we seem to be building, that the winners not only get some fair advantage by the fact that they have more resources, have better schooling, have more access to capital, but that they've actually now jerry-rigged a system to make sure that not only do they start off with all those natural advantages, but then they sort of buy public policy outcomes that exacerbate the trends that you described. And I wonder whether, in that context, you would take up the initial charge to you and just reflect a little bit on whether you think that that we are now have a policy context where the kinds of things that you're documenting, or the kinds of economic trends that you're documenting, are really being exacerbated or enhanced, or we're pushing the edges out on the problems that the people that you've chronicled have had to deal with, or whether it's just a kind of natural aspect of the way the economy works in a globalized world today.
Let me take sort of runs at that in a couple different ways. David argues in the book not just that there's corruption in the payoff sense, not just that there's corruption in the buying outcomes sense, but in the very early part of the book argues that they own the language too, so that the stuff just doesn't get discussed. That is a sweeping claim, and before you make it, in making it, there needs to be an appreciation for sort of how we got here. And one way you can do that, and one way, John, I tried to do this in some of the stories I've done, is just talk a little about the late 70s and early 80s. I suspect that this audience has no sympathy for Ronald Reagan, but they were an astoundingly screwed up time. The economy was a mess, and something needed to be done. And the notion that we are where we are because of this kind of deep-seated corruption of both payoffs, bought policy outcomes, and bought language, I think isn't true to the history we've lived through over the last 25 years. That now, in the light of, now that we're older and wiser, we can look back and you ought to be able to acknowledge that Ronald Reagan had something when it came to the economy. We did need to do something. The question, I think, is that, do we need to keep going in that direction, or is there as there has been throughout American history, have we reached a pendulum point, at the outer swing of a pendulum? And that, I think, is legitimate. And I think that if someday in the future we look back and say, yes, this was the time we should have made the swing, and then it's not made now, you can say, well, it was delayed by many of the things that Sarota is talking about. But the question of whether or not we got here via corruption, I swore to myself I was going to stick to my knitting, and I'm the reporter. I haven't reported out that question, so I can't answer it definitively. My instincts are, no, we did not get here by corruption. We got here because we faced a problem, and policymakers at the time we faced it tried to tackle it. They tackled it with ideological blinkers. They tackled it in ways that advantaged some and disadvantaged others, but they had a real problem that they needed to tackle. And they did it.
Roy, you want to comment really on the same question?
Yeah, I think Peter makes some very good points about that. I think the assumption that the political economic model we have today is solely attributable to corruption, I think, is just mistaken. There's a lot of ways in which the United States has changed in the last 30 years that are actually are responses to things like globalization and technological change. It's a different world. Now, we've been getting arguably the wrong answers to how to respond to that. Big business has, corporate interests have taken advantage of the shifts in the system to try to press their agenda, and it's not been a very good agenda. But that said, it's not like the progressive or center left actually has the correct and easily perceivable solution to this as well. Harold Meyerson, I thought, had a very good article in the American Prospect the other day talking about the decline of middle-class, stable, especially blue-collar jobs in the United States. It was centered around talking around people in the Detroit area. And, it's the center left all over the industrialized world doesn't have particularly good answers now to how to deal with this increase in stability, the increase in competition from the rest of the world. It's not just a result of corruption, it's a result of change. Corruption makes it worse, but corruption is not the sole cause.
Well, I'm about to turn it over to the audience for questions, but I need to spend 1 minute being the Clinton guy on the panel because we've referenced Ronald Reagan and his political change, of course, and the impact on the economy. I just wrote a few statistics down, and I think David takes issue with some of this, and I want to get him to respond. But with reference back to Reagan, in Clinton's 8 years, 100 times more people were lifted out of poverty than in the Reagan 8 years, 7.7 million to be exact. We had the lowest poverty rate since the late 70s, the longest expansion in history. Obviously, with respect to fiscal discipline, a record deficit turned into a record surplus, the contrary, the flip of what we saw under Reagan's term in office. But in addition to that, I think for the middle class, there were 23 million jobs created. We had 5 consecutive years of real wage growth. Family income rose 17%. Median income for African Americans grew by a third, Hispanics by 24%. The wealth gap got bigger. Although people added to their assets, I think that the combination of policies it may have slowed down, but it didn't stop the wealth gap from spreading. Now, David, I think, takes issue even with that and suggests that some of that. I mean, I think he has a particular hang-up on trade and NAFTA and open markets. But I think that in general, I think he may characterize even that level of economic success as being having a dark downside, which is the influence of big business on that core set of politics. But again, from my perspective. The mission of the administration was really aimed centrally at trying to raise incomes and tries to raise living standards for citizens, and I think we did pretty well in doing that. So I wanted to give David a shot at responding to that, and responding to the Reagan point as well.
First and foremost, I as somebody who's worked for Democrats and who still considers myself a Democrat, I think I make it pretty clear in here that I think that the Clinton administration was a heck of a lot better than the previous administrations and subsequent administrations. I think that we are in part living through some of the negative consequences of the Clinton administration economic policies. That's why I say that this problem that we're dealing with is a bipartisan problem. NAFTA has, for instance, worked to destroy American wages and undermine Americans' benefits. It's pretty simple why. It's a trade deal that was deliberately free of major labor, human rights, environmental protections. They weren't in those deals. It wasn't in the China PNTR deal. And I think the China PNTR deal, I think it was signed in 2000, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And now, so there wasn't really a Clinton administration to sort of be at the head of the helm when the ramifications of that kind of deal went into effect. And I think that we are living through some of that. And I'll just give you one example. Here's the New York Times on the 7-year anniversary. This is of NAFTA, not even of China. Quote, this was buried in the story, of course. Quote, wage increases are being held down, especially in manufacturing, by a persistent fear among workers about losing their jobs despite the strong economy. Kate Bronfenbrenner from Cornell documented how after NAFTA was passed, many companies used NAFTA as a threat for workers when they went on strike, when they demanded better wages. One company in upstate New York, for instance, brought vans that said moving to Mexico outside of the factory when workers were striking. So I do think there were gains made under the Clinton administration, especially in terms of some of the, at least preserving the social safety net. I think that, and I want to get to these 2 points that I sort of forgot to get to, but tie into this. You know, Rui said that my book doesn't mention education. I think that this is one of the great myths, the education myth that I've written about, is that if we just educate everybody, everyone just gets basically a college education, our economy is going to be great, everyone's going to find a job. Well, I would argue that with the trade policies that we have and some of these other policies that crush the middle class, we'll have a nation of highly educated, low-wage workers, or perhaps unemployed workers. That you cannot educate your way out of problems in an economy that is undermined by structural policies designed to tamp down and crush the middle class. The second thing I think that I wanted to get to, and I think this is important, and it again relates to the Clinton record, is that, you know, people say, well, you can't be too populist. Bill Clinton proved that you can't run on sort of populist themes, and, you know, corruption stuff touches on the populist themes. Well, Bill Clinton, at least as I remember it, and one of his famous speeches, I have it cited in the book, I'm not going to quote it from memory, but he basically ran as a populist. One of his speeches, he said he would never sign trade deals with China if they don't better treat their workers. He would never sign a trade deal with Mexico unless there were labor and wage standards. I mean, that is almost a direct quote, and I can pull it up if people don't believe me. And then he went ahead 2 years later and signed NAFTA, and then a couple of years later he signed the China trade deal. And so this touches on another thing that Rui said about how, Kerry and Gore lost this many white working class voters, and that means progressives aren't connecting. And I think that's a subtle but dangerous linguistic change. Conflating Democrats automatically with progressives or populists, I think, is a major mistake. The fact, I would argue, that Kerry and Gore didn't do better among the working class, and let's just take Ohio, for example, it has a major white working class demographic, is because Kerry had absolutely no position, for instance, on trade. This is a state that's lost 300 or 400 or maybe even 500,000 manufacturing jobs. If a Democrat runs for president and has no real position on trade, and perhaps among many workers, the last thing they remember about Democrats and trade was that a Democratic president rammed through Congress NAFTA and China PNTR, which sold those workers out. If you go into a state like that, you're not going to be able to attract white working class voters unless you actually speak to the policies that are hurting them. And just to close, I've had some experience with this personally out in Montana. When I worked for Brian Schweitzer both in 2000 and 2004, his campaign was openly based on populist economic themes. In 2000, it was going up against the drug industry. In 2004, it was going up against a corrupt former administration, and it was basically running as an outsider to the political establishment, saying that it had basically been bought off. And these themes and this politics is not just pie in the sky. This is politics that allows Democrats, I think, to win in red states. And I have a whole article documented in the American Prospect about that. That this is not just moralizing or wishful thinking. That in districts, conservative districts across the country, Democrats can win by fusing together, or by realizing there's a way to bridge a gap between progressives and traditionally conservative voters by being willing to stand up to big money interests.
Ray, you want to, I think there was a little bit of a challenge in some of what David said, but I don't know, I could also open it to the
You can just
audience.
open it to questions.
Okay. Right there. Well, we got, could you identify yourself and go with the mic?
Yes, my name is Bill Neal. I write about the future of the Democratic Party. And David, I sent you a long essay which may have scared you away from the bite length. I want to connect your observation. Maybe corruption is too strong a word, but inherent in the Reagan Revolution was the elevation of the entrepreneur, not just from the pedestal where they always are in American life, but to the altar. One nation, one market under God is a good way to summarize that. And the language follows. Trace the use of the term bottom line from an accounting term to showing up in sermons and every type of other type of discussion. But here's my connection. By elevating the entrepreneur to that status, the countervailing powers and brakes on that type of power that existed even under Eisenhower republicanism have fallen away. The institutional checks, and I do feel we're living in the late 1920s with hedge funds and derivatives just over the horizon. It's not just me that senses that. The crucial checks and balances from other forces in society, including populist and progressive countervailing powers, are missing, and that helps pave the way for corruption. And I'd just like you to comment on that.
I think you touch on an important point that entrepreneurship has been used as a something to deify, and I think it is a very important part of an innovative, dynamic economy. I think, though, what this book argues is similar to what you're saying, is that, having a government that is wholly owned by corporate America does not serve ordinary citizens, and it does not serve small businesses, and it does not serve entrepreneurs. It only serves huge businesses and hugely wealthy people who have enough discretionary income to buy a seat at the table. And I can just give you one example for entrepreneurs. the bankruptcy bill was written and touted as a pro-business piece of legislation. That's another red flag word, pro-business. Everything that gives away the store is pro-business. Everything that protects ordinary people, well, that's anti-business. Well, what we found out from the bankruptcy bill, the pro-business piece of legislation, was that the new reforms, the gutting of bankruptcy protections, was actually destroying and particularly hurting entrepreneurs. That it was driving down it was a big New York Times story about how entrepreneurs were less willing to take risks, knowing that if they didn't come through, they'd be indentured servants, thanks to the new bankruptcy bill. And we can see this attack on entrepreneurs and small businesses throughout. I mean, the Walmart's ability in local and state government to buy itself subsidies that other companies, small businesses, can't get, obviously give Walmart, for instance, a huge advantage in moving into communities and destroying small business and entrepreneurs. That doesn't serve business as a whole. That doesn't obviously serve society. It serves huge companies, and Walmart's just one example, that has a huge amount of money at its discretion to buy those policies.
Can I just comment? I mean, if I understand what you said correctly, you, like David, believe that there's been that the language has changed in a way that stacks the deck against progressive Democrats, whatever you want to call it. And I think you have to ask yourself, do we really have an electorate that sort of doesn't get it all? There are certainly years, we certainly have examples in political campaign years where certain words, certain images basically turn into are polarizing, and you just can't get out from under the rhetoric. But over the long haul, do we really have a problem with our language? Do you really think that if you believe that, then how is it that American politics has worked as well as has worked over 2.5 centuries? I mean, I just don't. It's hard for me to understand that this is a language problem that we face. I mean, it seems like there's some more practical things that need to be discussed other than the deification of the word entrepreneur.
We lost from the late 1920s into the Depression, and I don't think the average citizen understood the problems in the stock market just as today, because Democrats don't have a clear narrative, and I want them to get them that is part descriptive and warning, but also optimistic, and we have the solutions. Hedge funds and derivatives are the worries of serious people like Paul Volcker, George Soros, and so forth, and Kevin Phillips, not the least, see far more ominous clouds than you do. And I want to be fair to the average citizen. They're so busy keeping their heads above water. I don't understand hedge funds. I know they're a serious problem, and I do worry about that, and I think you should too. And you do have to have an upbeat side. You just can't say despair. You have to have a narrative, and I want the party to get a narrative. I want progressives to get a better narrative about it.
Lady right there, if I can see.
Yes, I'm Celia Wexler. I'm with Common Cause. And I'm very interested in this whole notion of language and what happened to it. And I don't know if your book gets into this, and I'd really be interested in all the panelists commenting on this. But during the Reagan years, about 85% of the Federal Communication Commission's regulations were repealed. And that did have a great impact on the structure of media and media ownership. Opened the door for media consolidation that got worse and worse as we got into the 90s in 1996. And whether you see a connection between shrinking number of owners of media, more bottom line pressures on reporters so that in-depth reporting is harder to find, at least in mainstream media, and this whole issue of who owns the language, how issues are expressed and discussed, and what American people may or may not know about their own plight and how it relates to government.
I'll try to take it real quick, just about the book and language. The book essentially asserts that language is used as a justification for a predetermined agenda. That the impetus in politics today largely is to serve big money interests. Whether that doesn't affect, occasionally helps, and often hurts ordinary citizens. That the language is the public justification. And that the reason why I would argue that people tend to tell pollsters they know something's wrong, can't exactly put their finger on exactly what's wrong, and they also say that they want far different solutions than are being proposed by the government. The reason that is because people are under a flood of language that makes them think that the political system is trying to work for them. That when a politician goes out and says why they're voting for the bankruptcy bill, for instance, because it's pro-business and we need to crack down essentially on lazy people who don't pay their debts. That was the big, I'm paraphrasing here, but that was the big narrative during the bankruptcy bill. We just want to crack down on these lazy people who don't pay their debts. Let's forget about the fact that most people declare bankruptcy because they have a medical problem in their family or a death in the family. It's just lazy people. The idea is that there's they know what they want to do. They've known what they've wanted to do for a long time, and they create false storylines. Now, is it sort of George Lakoff, or is it George Lakoff and Frank Luntz exactly? Or do I think that they're always sitting around, coming up with the exact right word? No, and I think the book says that. It's the overarching storylines that can be put into specific language that I think is where corruption, and the corruption I talk about, is justified.
Peter, I maybe ask you to pick up on the media concentration point and what your observations are about the structure of, you've been in the business for a long time. Have things really changed? Are obviously the
we're
big...
scared to death. I mean, let me see if I can do something before I address that, which is go back to what I said before. I guess the argument that I'm making is that Americans, it's not that in certain debates, the debate over the bankruptcy bill, certain ways of framing the story weren't politically important. They weren't politically important. And it's not that the language hasn't changed in some systemic way over the last 25 years. It has changed. It's that Americans are innovative people who can figure out how to talk about what bothers them and what they want in whatever language you give them. The pitch, I realized as I was sitting here that what I just said here was about language too. I'm pitching my way of talking about it versus somebody else's way of talking about it. I guess all I'm saying is that the language that has come out of the last 25 years of economic change, the language where bottom line means more than an accounting term, but something greater, where 401k has an iconic meaning that, that language is strong enough that it's sort of what we've got on the ground, but that it is rich enough that people can talk about their economic circumstances using it. In effect, what I see myself as having done is say, okay, I'll play this rule with business language. You want to play the free market game? We'll talk about risks and rewards. Hey, we have got some great reward signals. We've got the stock market flashing, all the time. Where are the risk measures? Where are the risk measures? Well, the insurance companies have the risk measures. The hedge funds have the risk measures. What's your risk measure? What's the risk measure for American families? Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's the nostrum, don't put all your eggs in one basket. That is sort of, that's what we got. We're given certain nostrums. And so my argument is, go with the language we got in front of us, but it can be used, it is rich enough to talk about the circumstances that really matter to Americans today. On the question of media concentration, I'd just say to you this, that I'm inside the beast, so I don't know what's really going on. I work for one of the very largest media companies in the country whose stock is doing terribly, thank you very much, and that is rumored to be in play. I've been allowed to, I'm appearing at this panel today, I've spent years covering the stuff I've just talked with you about, and I'm going to spend the next year trying to craft a book out of it. It may all fall on its face, right? The jig that all of the journalists in this room have, that the gig that we all have, that we all love, may all collapse. Is it going to collapse because there's concentration, or for some other reason? I just say there are a lot of forces at play, and it ain't just concentration that's doing it. I mean, the internet has got a lot to do with it, and so, again, I'm nervous as hell about it, but I'm not sure that you can put it to corporate concentration. Or put it solely to corporate concentration.
Rui, politics of definition?
Yeah, I think that this is a reasonable time to bring that up. I think the concept that the language that is being used in political debate, whether or not it's being driven primarily by corporate concentration in the media or not, I think it's a mistake to think that it's the content, the type of language that we're using nowadays that's really at fault in terms of progressives being able to define themselves clearly in the public mind and in the minds of voters. The problem lies, I think, more with progressives themselves and their inability to define themselves clearly in the public mind, voters' minds, in terms of what they are for. I think at this point, most voters know, for example, that Democrats are the party that is more anti-big business. They know, if you ask them in polls, they always say that Bush and the Republican Party, overwhelmingly, they say that's the party on the side of big corporation. If you ask them which party is for the middle class, the Democrats have overwhelming advantages of 30 to 40 points. I mean, these are big. And the question is, why can't that be translated into a political advantage for progressives and into a majority coalition? And I think the answer is people don't know what progressives are for. What are they for on healthcare? What are they for on Iraq? I mean, how are they going to deal with globalization? How do they stand on a variety of questions? And what's their overarching philosophy? We recommended in our analysis, the politics of definition, that it should be a common good progressives, and that's what we're for. We're not just against, the way big business runs sort of turns things to their advantage. We're for a common good progressivism, puts the common good at the center of political debate and public policy. So I think it's not a matter of having to, break up the media monopolies and fundamentally change the language that's used in everyday discourse. It's a matter of defining what progressives are for.
I think we've got time for a few more. Let's go to the back. Why don't we take a couple of questions at once, and first the gentleman in the far back, and then Tom will come forward.
My name is Rex Lamb from Progressive Maryland. I've got two questions that aren't related, and they're for any one of you four. One, has there been interesting examples of when progressives have used political jiu-jitsu to get big money interests, like maybe worker-friendly companies or something, to affect another corporation, capital strategies, that kind of thing? And secondly, I'm curious about what your insights are into the rise of the netroots, its impact on politics today, issue advocacy, but also electoral campaigns. Thank you.
Maybe we'll get one from the netroot expert there and right in front of him.
Hi, Tom Matsey with MoveOn.org. I just wanted to ask for Rui and Peter. So, what makes, because I was going through the book, and for each chapter there's 9, 10, 11 different ideas. And, this thesis that you're not going, by standing up and fighting for something, against something, you're not showing people what you're for. I'm trying to understand how you get that out of David's book. And so that's what I wanted to ask about. Because I think actually, Paul Wellstone said you can figure out what you stand for by fighting, or you sometimes, fighting against something, you figure out what you stand for. That was the quote. It strikes me when you're fighting against, the Bush energy policy, you can figure out you want better efficiency, more conservation, more alternative sources, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't understand where this thesis comes from that progressives don't have ideas. This book, every chapter's got 10 of them.
That's a great question.
We'll take one more, and then we'll let the panel answer it all.
Al Milliken, Washington Independent Writers. Particularly when it comes to the corrupting economic influence of China, is every American consumer buying Chinese a willing participant in their own corruption?
Good question.
David, you want to
Okay.
handle any of this?
I will try. First of all, okay, so I'm going to try to take these in order. So, is there an effort to take big money interests and try to get them to work for ordinary citizens' interests? You know, I talked with somebody recently. I said the next book I might, somebody could write a whole book, and I'm not a historian, somebody could write a whole book about how the economic history of America is one set of corporations ganging up against another set of corporations. And so I think that the idea that you can do that is a good one, and it's an important strategy. I think, for instance, on healthcare, I'm excited at the idea that not that GM workers, for instance, are potentially going to lose their health care, but that GM might see that a universal health care system is in its best interest. What is that in reality? That's one set of corporations, you know, employers potentially ganging up on health insurance companies. You know, I think that might happen with prescription drugs. I think that might also happen with energy. You know, high energy prices may hurt consumers. It also hurts small businesses and big business. So I think there's a strategy to be found there. I haven't written about it hugely in this book. I've sort of mentioned it, but that's definitely an avenue for policy thinking. The rise of the net roots, I think, you know, when I talk about public financing of elections, I think the small d democratization of fundraising has been a positive effect. I don't think it will cure the system like a public financing system does, but I think that has a positive effect. I also think that the ability of smaller information gatherers to have a bigger platform that the internet provides, I think that's terrific. I think it's very important, and it might be a factor in, both of those might be a factor in fighting against the hostile takeover. The third question about my book, that was a good question that I hope to hear the answer from. And then, is every American complicit when they buy Chinese goods? Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the answer is no. I think what's complicit, I think our government is complicit in creating an economy that is increasingly based on goods only produced from foreign manufacturers. I think you can't blame the person who walks into the store and they need to provide for their kids. They need to buy subsistence goods. The issue is that we have economic policies that are now making sure and helping to make sure that more goods and more of the economy is sold off to cheap overseas labor markets. That's the problem.
Peter, you want to
with regard to Tom's question, look, I want to just be clear. I don't take a position on the book. I mean, I came in here and I didn't answer the question that was posed to me because it doesn't seem my place. Okay, so I don't say anything about whether they're being against something is whether there's any program or that or not. That's Rui.
All right, Roy, you take that.
All right. Well, I'm not afraid to take a position. So, well, first of all, just about the netroots, I'm a big fan of the netroots. I'm arguably a member of the netroots myself, and I think the key aspect of the netroots isn't so much their political position on any of these issues, but rather their fundamental pragmatism. They want to beat the other side, and they want to reform the Democratic Party and the progressive movement in general to do that. So I'm all for that, but it is going to make a difference what we say and how we say it, which brings me to this point about the way David pitches things in his book. I don't think that the way he pitches things is fundamentally aspirational. I think it is fundamentally us against them, class against class in a sense, our interests against theirs, and that to get the issue is not, I think the policies leave some stuff out. There isn't much about education. I think education is profoundly important for the typical American today, and it is how they see themselves get ahead. And I think it is telling it's left out. But even in terms of the policies that are in this book, the question is, how can you get the policies? I mean, there's nothing. I mean, if those policies could all be implemented tomorrow, it would be a better country and a better world. But how can you get people to support them? And I don't think you can generate the kind of support you need, particularly among the white working class voters I've talked about. We don't need to change the overall language that's used in this country, but we do need to be careful about how we use language and the message we communicate to people. And if they think that you're saying that you're a loser, that you're not getting anywhere, your life is stymied and stuck, you're not going anywhere, social mobility in this country is fake. Frankly, I think the concept that you're going to win over a lot of people in this country by telling them social mobility is a crack is ludicrous. People believe in social mobility in this country. They've always overestimated the degree of social mobility in this country, and they probably overestimate it more today. But that is what people believe. That is what people want. And if you tell them they're not getting what they want, even though they think to some extent they are, I think you've lost them to some extent right from the get-go. I also think that you're not going to make that much progress in getting to the policies you want if, and this gets to something John mentioned very early in this panel, if you demonize those people with whom you have honest disagreements or have some disagreements. I think there are people who have different views about trade in the progressive movement. There are people who, for example, feel as I do that we need to combine aspiration with criticizing the way big money does have undue influence on the system. But they're not all the enemies. They just have a different idea about how progressives can succeed in this country, and those are reasonable disagreements, and we have to pay attention to them because you need a majority coalition if you hope to succeed. You're not going to succeed, again, simply by telling the truth about big money and putting some progressive policies out there and assuming that, one connects to two. That's kind of your strategy right there. Again, as a reference book, pretty good. As a collection of interesting policies, though there are some things left out, pretty good. But I think I'll have to stick with my position. I think as a strategic framework, it is sadly lacking.
Let's take a couple more, and then David can respond to Rui in the context of. We'll just take these last two, and then we're going to have to call it quits.
So yeah,
if we can be brief too, please.
I as your somewhat older voter here, but not that much older, agree with a lot of what you said, and I think it would help me and those folks in Middle America, not here in D.C., not up the East Coast, who are not voting, who are concerned, who have concerns about the different labels and the language. The language, the negative language, I believe, that comes out is from the political campaign people that are hired to put out all the negative language and words about whomever is running. I do believe you've got to say what you're for. So could you please explain to me, as a perfect voter who's somewhat disillusioned, what is the difference between a Democrat and a progressive? When or how will those elected officials on the Hill and at the state and federal level and local, state, federal, local, city, all different levels, begin to talk to each other, whether you're a D or an R, and say, it's okay, we can disagree to agree, so we can make some good decisions, and get those folks out to vote, because I believe you're going to need to mentor some younger people to run for office who may not agree with the Democrat or progressive or conservative or whatever policies, and is this going to lead to the possibility that independent voters are going to rise up and say, let's throw the bums out until we can get some reasonable people in office.
That's the Tom Friedman theory. We have one last question right up here, if you could be quick, and then we'll let the panel wrap up. This gentleman right here.
Chia Chen, freelance correspondence. David, I'd like to bring to the very basic. If you say that the rule is deep in the campaign finance, I think three things have to be dealt with or explained. First is this. Usually people say, oh, campaign finance, the money just spent in the campaign process. Could you explain that those money did reach the politician? And second is this. Use Peter word, buy-in and outcome. Okay, you spend money, you buy something. But there's no connection about money. Nobody talk about connection between the money and outcome. And third is this. Okay, you spend money, you buy something, you get some outcome. And people always say, well, if nobody spends some money, then there's nothing be done.
Okay, I think we have very limited time, so I think what I'm going to do, since both of those really were directed at David, is just let David wrap up and
Okay.
and finish up.
Okay, to Rui's point that we won't win, and essentially, you can't win, you can't get to a point where you can make the policies in the book real unless you have essentially winning politics. I don't disagree, and I think we have to understand there's a division between an outside role and an inside role. Politicians are going to think about the 2-year election cycle in front of them. I don't dispute that. I've worked on campaigns. I know what that's about. But what the right had, and what I think that our side doesn't yet have, is a strong outside infrastructure to hoe the road for the policy outcomes we want. So here's an example. On the social mobility thing, we talk about how voters, the stats basically show that voters have a different conception of social mobility in this country than actually exists. How do we bring the perception into reality? Well, I think look at what the right has done. When the right started pushing, when their outside organizations started pushing Social Security privatization 30 years ago, for instance, everyone said, you're crazy. You're absolutely insane. And then 2 years ago, we saw a president of the United States running around the country championing it. Now, it didn't pass, but the fact that they had even gotten to that point shows a role for public education. That outside organizations and institutions not connected to the electoral campaign process have a very important role to play in better educating the public. And that is what this book is about. This book is not a short-term political strategy guide. Second question, a Democrat versus a progressive. I've written a little bit about this. The basic way to put it is I think the difference between a Democrat and a progressive, and I think there are a lot of progressive Democrats, is that a Democrat, I think, is more comfortable using taxpayer money as a way to solve problems, and a progressive often sees other alternatives in simply challenging big money interests rather than simply trying to buy off big money interests. So for instance, a more liberal or standard D Democratic solution to the energy problem is tax subsidies to, perhaps green energy companies, other oil companies. A more progressive, I would argue, solution would be to have a federal price gouging law, to have a windfall profits tax, to fundamentally challenge the oil companies, to challenge the idea, policies that challenge the idea that these companies should be able to make as much money as they want no matter what the social ramifications. Similarly on prescription drug prices. A more liberal solution is to take a lot of taxpayer money and throw it at the drug companies to get them to give drugs to seniors. A more progressive solution, I would argue, is to allow the importation of cheaper FDA-approved prescription drugs, to lower the overall price of drugs, and or to, like other industrialized countries, consider some version of price controls on drugs, so that Americans aren't charged the highest prices for drugs in the world, rather than simply throwing a huge amount of taxpayer money at the companies that are already ripping us off. On the question about campaign finance reform, as I understand it, the question was about, what is bought for the money. And I would say that, again, this book is filled with individual examples of what is bought for the money. But I would say that in order to understand how things are bought for the money, we have to understand that the campaign finance system, the way elections are run, demands that candidates respond more closely to big money interests than they do to ordinary people. I mean, think about just being a politician. If you're running for office and you have to raise a huge amount of money, the first people you're going to listen to are the people who provide that money, because the next time around, if you want to get reelected, you need that support. So until we create a system that allows other people a different means of running for office, a system that doesn't select for people who are simply either good telemarketers or good at shaking down big money interests, we will not have a system that we, the public, owns.
Well, I want to thank David. I want to actually have the last word, because I think on the definitional point, David's definition of progressivism really, I think, it comes full circle and it really equates to populism. And I think that, again, I mentioned it at the beginning, Rui talked about it, but I think there's a different way of thinking about a progressive government that's really about the common good and searching for a proper role for government in regulating the marketplace, but also as an instrument for helping people achieve opportunity. And I don't know whether I don't think David would disagree with that. I think, though, that his emphasis on kind of big money liberalism, I suppose, is a kind of pejorative way of thinking about using government again as a place for opportunity for people to go to college, to succeed in life, to have a decent public education system, and to some extent to provide the basic social compact that is increasingly fraying, I think, in the United States. But I think that David's book is provocative. It's as Rui said, it's at a minimum, it's a great source book. At a maximum, I think it'll force us to push our thinking forward as we develop plans for how we can bring the country together. So we thank him for that. There's still copies available. You can buy them at the back of the room. I'm still hawking for you.
Happy to sign them.
David's happy to sign them. And we welcome him back. We'll probably have to have him back for a full-scale debate on NAFTA. I think that we not only we disagree a little bit about the facts as well as the circumstances of all that. And I would just, one factual correction, David, President Clinton didn't sign NAFTA, but he did sign the labor and environmental side agreement. So with that,
our energy policy, up until very recently, has largely focused on a debate between which oil companies to give which tax breaks to. And now we sit here with $3 gasoline, with skyrocketing utility costs, and we wonder why. Why was the debate limited essentially to those terms? Well, because there's large, big money interests making a lot of money off that. Interests that give a lot of money to politicians. It's the same thing with health care. Polls have consistently shown that Americans support a universal health care program. It's usually in the 60 to 70% range. It goes down just a bit when you ask folks whether they would accept some sacrifices, including taboo sacrifices like tax increases. That's not talked about in the political arena. It's sort of talked about in terms of expanding health care piecemeal, but the concept of a universal, for instance, single-payer health care system is not really ever legitimately discussed as a mainstream position, even though it is a mainstream position among the population. Prescription drugs. What is the effect on the average citizen, the debate that's gone on over prescription drugs? Well, we've had a Medicare bill that cost about $1 trillion that gave most of that to the drug companies because our debate never asked the question whether we should have some sort of controls on drug prices. And obviously, as many of you know, the Medicare bill was stripped of its ability to allow the government to negotiate lower prices for prescription drugs. And so for the average citizen, what we have is the people who are not covered by Medicare, prices continue to skyrocket out of control. The Medicare bill, for those who receive it, provides a completely inadequate benefit. Wages, this is obvious. The minimum wage has reached a 50-year low in terms of purchasing power. Any bill that comes up to raise the minimum wage is voted down. And if it's not voted down, then the alternative, like we saw last year, Rick Santorum's alternative, was a bill that purported to raise the minimum wage but would have eliminated the minimum wage for millions of people. And I think that corruption is also apparent to the average American and how it affects them in what we don't talk about. And the best example of this, I think, is on immigration. This is a debate that's been roiling the country. It's all over the media. It's a debate that focuses on whether to allow people who are here illegally to gain citizenship. And it's a debate that hasn't at all talked about one of the roots of the problem, the decimation of the Mexican economy. We have a debate going on about this issue that focuses exclusively on border control and citizenship questions, and not on questions of how our corporate written trade policy has destroyed the Mexican economy.
Since an intimate connection, and I mean that pun only partially, between campaign fundraisers and the lobbyists that advocate for appropriations earmarks often inserted into the dead of night in appropriations bills. David also worked on the Appropriations Committee for Congressman Dave Obey. He's well aware of that. But I think in the wake of the Cunningham bribery scandal, I think a lot of people around the country are wondering just how many members have been persuaded to support earmarks, not based on what it might do for their congressional district, but what it might do for them personally. The bottom line is that corruption has almost become the norm on Capitol Hill. I think it's a problem that got worse, particularly under Mr. DeLay's leadership, and can only be corrected by real substantial reform and not the cosmetic attempts at it that we saw in the House last week. This corruption on Capitol Hill and of our political culture in general is well documented in this new book. David's research demonstrates just how lucrative government can be for those who have a hand in writing special interest favors into law. His insight is sharp, his examination is critical, and true to form, it's not without controversy. While David and I agree that corruption is a serious threat to our system of government, we sometimes disagree, as we did while we were here. I think sometimes I see legitimate policy disputes that are occurring where David sees the influence of money and corruption. And I think that by attacking those who you have a substantive beef with, I think you end up demonizing the legitimate debate, and sometimes you blur the lines between guilt and innocence and hinder our ability to expose real corruption. But I think that David's book, I think, really does point to very, very serious flaws in our system, to corruption as a serious problem, and it's a problem that can't be solved by the entire system of actors. It has to be shown, demonstrated, and pinpointed, which is what he's done. I think the solution requires ultimately for all of us to work together. I saw Shelley Pingree from Common Cause enter. She's here someplace in the crowd. To expose, and I think all of us trying to work together can help expose real corruption, to push back on the radical ideas that are leading the country in the wrong direction, to restore a positive, progressive vision of government, and to do so in a way that speaks to all Americans. Today, I hope that we'll have an informative debate not only about how corruption is affecting the American people, but about how the progressive community can address it collectively. With that, it's now my pleasure to introduce our panel. As I mentioned, David Sirota is the author of the new book, Hostile Takeover: How Big Money and Corruption Conquered Our Government and How We Take It Back. He's the senior editor at In These Times, a regular contributor to The Nation and The American Prospect, a twice-weekly guest on The Al Franken Show, and the co-chair of the Progressive Legislative Action Network, which is a new organization which I hope David will talk about, which tries to get at this question at the state governmental level. Previously, David served as press secretary to Representative
affects average Americans. Columnists talk about recent government scandals, special interests, and changes to lobbying roles. From the Center for American Progress, this is an hour and a half.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Podesta, and on behalf of the Center for American Progress, I want to thank you all for being here. To kick things off, I want to begin by thanking David for coming back here today. I'll give a more complete bio later, but it's a pleasure to have one of our most quoted and quotable alums back at the Center. As some of you know, David served as a fellow here at CAP, where he helped get our daily publication, The Progress Report, up and running. For those of you who don't subscribe, I recommend it. His work was always sharp, his analysis was always hard-hitting, and his contributions to the Center were invaluable and immeasurable. And obviously we're here in part to celebrate David's book, Hostile Takeover, which I will talk again a little bit more about, but copies are available in the back or online at Amazon.com, I'm sure. Since leaving the Center for the Big Sky of Montana, David has not only become the world's most unlikely cowboy, he has helped the state elect its first Democratic governor in 16 years and has written a quite interesting book. That book, as I said, will help shape our discussion today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce the rest of our panelists and give a more formal introduction to David. But first, I wanted to say a few words about our topic today, how corruption affects the average American. We all know that the influence of money on politics is substantial, it's growing, and it has real consequences for you and me. At the state level, lobbying is already a $1 billion per year industry. This is no surprise when in much of America, state legislatures only serve part-time and with a severely limited staff. Without a staff to craft effective legislation for constituents, state legislators often turn to lobbyist pre-written legislation. Even at the national level, with more staff available to filter the lobbyist-authored legislation, folks like Jack Abramoff spent billions of dollars and developed increasingly creative and, of course, in his case, criminal ways to influence our public officials. Consider how Randy Duke Cunningham was able to take tens of thousands of dollars in bribes from defense contractors while living on a yacht provided by one of them. Or consider that Tom DeLay flew to his court-ordered appearance in his corporate money laundering case on a jet owned by R.J.R. Reynolds Tobacco Company, the same company that contributed $17,000 to his defense. It's important to note, though, that this pay-to-play system between lobbyists and lawmakers runs much deeper than a few members or a few campaign contributions, luxurious gifts, or even golf trips to Scotland. It's an institutionalized system of corruption, and that's, I think, what David's book really attempts to chronicle. For instance, as our senior fellow and another former colleague of David, Scott Lilly, has pointed out,
NAFTA has passed. Tens of millions more Mexicans are now in poverty. This is a bill that was stripped of all labor, human rights, and environmental provisions that may have moved towards having that trade policy benefit ordinary Mexicans. And so the fact that we're having a debate in this country, or in the political process, I should say, that doesn't even discuss NAFTA means that we are ultimately going to get a policy, any policy that comes out of it, I would argue, will not actually address the problem. And so the problem will continue. All of the problems associated with illegal immigration that do affect the average American, those won't be addressed. So the key here is, I think, and we can discuss the solutions to this, the solution I would submit has to be a real attack on the campaign finance system. Because what we have now is a government that is operating on behalf of the big money interests who finance political campaigns. Now, the argument against the public financing system of elections, for instance, is it's welfare for politicians. It's giving money to politicians. My answer to that is you get what you pay for. Somebody is going to pay for these elections. Somebody is paying for these elections. Large corporations and the super wealthy largely. And that until we give good people a way to run for office, which allows them to run for office without being specialists in shaking down big money interests for cash, we will never have a government that we own and that which can actually solve these problems. Because the fundamental problem we face is we don't have a government anymore that solves problems. Polls show that the public essentially knows that in all different sorts of ways. The reason why our government doesn't solve problems is because the policies that it produces from these distorted debates that I've talked about, these policies will never, ever challenge the big money interests that are often at the center of the challenges our country face. So this is what the book is all about. I hope folks will read it, ask questions to me about it. You can email me. We can talk about it here in this debate. But the fundamental assertion in this book is that in order to understand corruption, we have to understand that the debate on major economic issues is artificially distorted and limited to confine policy prescriptions only to those policies that do not challenge the interests at the heart of our problems.
Peter, you've covered this city for a while. What's your perspective on both David's argument and where you see things today in our nation's capital.
Well, let me start by saying I'm grateful to David.
Bernie Sanders, as a senior strategist to Montana Governor Brian Schweitzer, as I mentioned, as the press secretary of the House Appropriations Committee, and of course as a fellow here at the Center for American Progress. After we hear from David, we'll hear from Peter Goslin. He's the national economics correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, Washington, D.C. Bureau. In his prolific 30-year career in journalism, he has written for the Boston Globe, the Providence Journal, the Massachusetts Transcript, New York's Daily Mail, in addition to others. He's won numerous awards for his work, including the Sidney Hillman Award, the Aronson Award for Social Justice Reporting, the National Headliner Award, and he is a two-time winner of the George Polk Award. Peter holds a bachelor's degree from Brown and a master's from Columbia, and we're happy that he could join us today. And last, we'll hear from Rui Teixeira. Rui is a joint fellow here at the Center for American Progress and the Century Foundation. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has worked at the Progressive Policy Institute, the Economic Policy Institute, and Brookings Institution before joining our institution. Rui is an expert on voter turnout and public opinion. He's the author of 5 books, more than 100 articles, including The Disappearing American Voter and The Emerging Democratic Majority. He publishes a weekly online column, Public Opinion Watch. He has a very important, along with another fellow here at the center, John Halpin, a very important piece up currently on the American Prospect website, which I recommend to you all. I'm now going to turn over the floor to David to make some introductory comments, followed by remarks from Peter and then Rui. Then maybe I'll ask a question or two and then open it up to the audience.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the Center for hosting this event, and I want to thank the panelists here for agreeing to do it. I want to thank everybody who's here, especially in light of the fact that this book, as John alluded to, obviously pulls no punches, so I appreciate the forum. The fundamental assertion of this book is that corruption goes way beyond Duke Cunningham, Tom DeLay, bribery, and vote buying. That corruption is really at the heart of how politicians in the political debate talk about issues. And that the debates on the major economic issues of the day are designed to marginalize the common sense policies that Americans support and that public opinion shows Americans support. And that's pretty well documented in the book. The question for this forum is, how does that corruption affect the ordinary citizen? Because as the book says in the introduction, this book is really for the ordinary citizen. I use that term not derisively. It's a term that's used because I think a lot of political books and a lot of the political debate is designed not to be speaking to the ordinary citizen out there, and that's part of the reason why cynicism is so heavily on the rise. And I think it's quite clear. I think we have a lot of recent examples as to how corruption affects the ordinary citizen. A good example is energy.